So here we are, people, with the last lecture of the term. And it's the topic I keep referring to, saying, oh, eventually we'll look at religion again when we look at evolutionary biology. So that's the title of the lecture, and it's going to be in 4 parts, I think. But it's not all about religion. It's really maybe more of a history of evolutionary biology with various philosophical commentary along the way, with religion as one of the things I want to comment about. And the picture here obviously is some sort of attempt to show the evolution of life on Earth. I've got humans as the last thing here, maybe not quite the last thing to evolve, but pretty recently. We've got Emmy Noether here, a physicist standing in for the human race. Yeah. Okay. And so in terms of the kind of religious interpretations of evolution, big issue is whether humanity is, as it were, an accident, something that just came about through natural forces without any sort of plan or purpose, or whether we're made in God's image or something like that. Okay, so going very quickly through some of the ancient views on where life came from. Funnily enough, we kind of have the creationists and the evolutionists back then too. You might say that Plato was at least a kind of creationist, not a young earth creationist or anything like that, not a believer in God as such, but still a believer in design in some way. So he also didn't think that there was any evolution, because the species, the different kinds of living organism, were, he thought, defined by these abstract forms, similar to the geometrical forms like sphere and cube and so on. And they're sort of rational ideas. And since the forms don't change, then species don't change either. So the actual physical organisms, the actual natural beings, were created by a kind of craftsman, he thought, known as the demiurge, using the forms as templates. Okay, so it's a kind of creationism in that he thought there was design behind it all. I've got some quotes here from, Socrates coming up. Anyway, so Aristotle was maybe not quite as much of a creationist as Plato, but still kind of, well, he certainly rejected chance as an explanation for where living organisms came from. And he also applied notions of purpose and goal to biology. He thought that, each organism has a purpose, and the parts of organisms have purposes that contribute to the goal of the organism, and so on. Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Here's some quotes from Socrates here. Obviously, he didn't write anything. These are quotes in other authors. He says, with such signs of forethought in these arrangements in living organisms, can you doubt whether they are the work of chance or design? And he means they're obviously design. And here he talks about sex organs being contrivances, that is, products of engineering, of one who deliberately willed the existence of living creatures. Yeah, I don't know exactly what being he thought was the creator, whether he accepted some sort of demiurge theory like Plato or what, but anyway. And these are reported by Xenophon, because Socrates didn't write anything. Okay. So on the other corner in the ancient world were the atomists. They were kind of the evolutionists of the day, you might say. So for them, there was no design, there was no purpose. The sort of bedrock of reality was these atoms moving in the void. There were no gods or anything like that, no spirits. So, well, where would organisms come from? Well, they did appeal to chance, this explanation that Aristotle rejected. Now you might say, well, there's very little chance of very low probability of pure chance generating anything functional, and they agreed. Or even if you get something halfway functional, it might, for example, have lungs that aren't connected to its mouth or something. So it's going to suffocate within a few seconds that it appears. They're going to have design flaws, as it were, even though they're not designed, but what would otherwise be design flaws that would kill them very quickly. So sometimes these are referred to as monsters. And they're just going to die very quickly. So it's no surprise that we don't see them anywhere around us. But if occasionally a viable organism just appears by chance, just by atoms randomly coming together in the right pattern, then the viable ones are going to reproduce, and so those are the ones we see around us. Okay. Now, in terms of the relation between science and religion, I want to bring up this thinker, St. Augustine, who was a Platonist, and then he became a Christian. And his dates are sort of early in the Christian era here, a few hundred years after Jesus. Now we've seen a little bit of this stuff when we talked about Galileo and Cardinal Bellarmino and so on, and how with a religious text that may have some scientific consequences, it's a question of always whether you should read it literally or not. Like when it says in the Bible that the sun rises, does that actually imply that the sun moves and so on, or can you just read that as the sun appears to rise? Just describing the appearances rather than the reality. Anyway, so Augustine has some things to say here, and he actually didn't think that Christians should read the Bible too literally. That often that wouldn't be the author's intention. For example, if they're using metaphors or hyperbole, that's where you deliberately exaggerate to make some sort of literary point, poetic license, and so on. Also Augustine, like other medievals later on, like Aquinas, and we found also Bellarmino, if there seems to be a contradiction between very solid science and somebody's interpretation of scripture, then you should adjust the interpretation of scripture, because there can't be any disagreement between scripture properly interpreted and good solid science. But that only applies to proven science. You don't sort of bend the interpretation of scripture for the sake of every half-baked theory that comes along, which is Bellarmino's point, if you remember. Here's a often quoted passage from St. Augustine, talking about how, sometimes a non-Christian scientist knows something about the natural world, and then it's just sort of very embarrassing, and, it makes everybody cringe. Well, especially people in the church, it makes everybody cringe to hear a Christian talk nonsense about science. Okay, and we should avoid that, Augustine says. Okay. All right, now, so those are sort of some ancient creationists and evolutionists. Let's fast forward now, skipping many centuries to 1800, and here's Lamarck. So a lot of the people we're going to look at, most of them are actually either French or English. That seems to be where most of the work is being done, around the 19th century especially. In the 20th century, we've got a few other people, a few other nations represented. So we've got Lamarck here, who's French. So at that time, nobody used the word evolution to refer to how living organisms came about. The word evolution at this time actually refers to the development of a single organism from sort of egg to the adult form. So the term for what we call evolution now was transmutation, this idea that one species turns into another over long periods of time. So first of all, transmutation is definitely opposed to Plato's and Aristotle's view, which is often called essentialist, that there's some essence for each species or form that makes it that species. And that sort of really prevents you from having sort of gradual, very gradual changes, because at what point are you going to lose that essence and acquire a new one? You know, it's kind of on or off. Anyway, so transmutation is opposed to these ancient Greek writers that were more favored in the Middle Ages. I think I've said before that during the Middle Ages, Plato and Aristotle were, you know, very highly regarded philosophers in Christian Europe, whereas the atomists were, you know, those guys, you know. But in the early modern period, atomism had a bit of a revival. I think I mentioned all this in the mechanical philosophy lecture. Anyway, yeah, so Lamarck is interesting because he was a materialist, and it's, you know, definitely a materialist theory of where life came from. So very much along the lines of the ancient atomists. But he didn't just say it was due to chance. I guess he didn't think that was very likely. Um, in fact, it sounds more like vitalist, what he's talking about. He's talking about the life force, okay? Some French phrases here, if you know, basically, yeah, the power of the life force, the power which tends unceasingly to bring things into organization, you know, to sort of create structure. Yeah, so this life force is sort of driving, is sort of inside living organisms, and it's sort of driving them onward and upward to more and more complexity, more and more sophistication, all right? But at the same time, he thought this life force was purely physical. He's not saying it's some kind of spirit or anything like that. Okay. And some other things that he included in his theory was spontaneous generation, which was pretty widely regarded at the time. That actually came from Aristotle too. And so this was ongoing. This wasn't just sort of one event billions of years ago. This was, as with Aristotle, something that just happened on a daily basis. You know, microbes and so on just appearing out of sterile material. And also the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That means that, for example, if you work out a lot and you develop big muscles, and then you have kids, those kids will also have at least a tendency for the big muscles. You know, you'll sort of pass the work that you've done onto your children. They'll be different as a result of the things that you've done. Yeah. Now, quite often when people talk about Lamarckian evolution today, they just focus on this inheritance of acquired characteristics, even though it wasn't particularly a big part of his view. You know, for him, his mechanism of evolution was more about this life force, but people don't really talk about that today. Certainly not in the sciences. The historians would, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it's if you read some of what he writes about how evolution happens, it seems kind of magical, even though it's supposed to be a fully naturalistic theory. So you can maybe understand why he came in for a lot of abuse later in the century, you know, before Darwin came along. Nobody really put much faith in Lamarck's theory. He says here, the rapid motion of fluids will etch canals between delicate tissues. Okay, well, that sounds kind of materialistic. You might have seen at the beach if, you know, there's a river going out to the ocean over the sand, it's going to create kind of ripples and things like that. Okay, you know, rapid motion of fluids can cause interesting patterns. The fluids themselves, oh, sorry, yeah, soon their flow will begin to vary, leading to the emergence of distinct organs. Well, wait, okay, suddenly organs, like heart, liver, kidneys, eyes, I don't know. It seems like the sort of complexity problem isn't really addressed here, much less solved. The fluids themselves, now more elaborate, will become more complex, just because, engendering a greater variety of secretions and substances composing the organs. So it seems like you know, all the structure kind of emerges magically here, even though it's supposed to be a fully naturalistic theory, materialistic theory. So not many people take this stuff too seriously, even in the 19th century. Okay, well, skipping along here, we've got another Frenchman, Cuvier, a creationist. And, biologist of great authority, prestige, top of his profession here. So, like most people at that time, notice this is sort of overlapping with Lamarck here in his dates. He would have been, 33 or something when Lamarck published his theory. He rejected transmutation, and at that time, basically, he was rejecting Lamarck's theory. And he says, yeah, the anatomical parts of living organisms are too interdependent. An organism isn't just sort of a random collection of things, as if, for example, you went through a junkyard and you picked the engine from one car and the wheels from another and the body from another and so on and so forth. And you tried to sort of make a functioning car out of it all, which maybe you could, but it would take quite a lot of tricky work to do that, to make it all kind of interface with each other. So animals aren't like that at all. Everything is kind of integrated. The heart is the right size for other parts, and they all kind of work together as a very harmonized whole. And that can't happen by material processes, according to Cuvier. It takes thought, it takes planning, engineering to bring about that kind of integration. Also, he has a problem with transmutation because the fossil record seems to be, clear, certainly a progression of species. It's not like the cast of characters that are here on Earth are always the same. Certainly species come and other ones go, but there are no sort of gradual blending from one to the next. They seem to be rather discrete. When a new species emerges, it's not that similar to anything previous. Okay. Yeah, so that's kind of what I've already covered. So Cuvier's specialty was with fossils. So what did he see? Well, you have layers of rock, strata, and the oldest ones are generally at the bottom and the youngest at the top. So you can kind of read the history of life like a book by going up and up through these layers. So he sees change over time, certainly, but he doesn't see the gradual blending, as I just mentioned. You don't see the transitional forms between different species. And so he thought it was a series of creations. Now, in the Bible, it seems to be just sort of 1 week. So there's a bit of a conflict there, maybe between the Bible and the geological evidence. But of course, it's always possible to make up a story to sort of harmonize these things. Okay. So he saw, a series of separate creations with, maybe large periods of time in between. And for each set, God would wipe out the previous lot with the flood and then, create a new bunch. Okay, and Noah's flood was maybe just the last one. Yeah, so let's think about geology in the book of Genesis. So as geology progressed, of course, they're discovering more and more. They're finding more and more interesting fossils and rock layers and so on. And without going into details, increasingly they were seeing tension between the book of Genesis, particularly just having one big sort of deluge, and a lot of geology just arising from the flood. That really, a relatively recent time ago, it became increasingly difficult to take that seriously. And so people were sort of inserting extra periods of time inside the biblical text. I don't want to go on about this too much, but there's a theologian here in 1814 who proposed that a gap existed in the Genesis narrative between the book's first and second verses. Okay, so before you get very far into the book, you already have to insert a few million years there. Yeah, and as creation in the Bible happens in days, certain creatures appear on each day. It's easy to say, well, these aren't literal days. These are sort of indefinitely long periods of time that we can kind of maybe see in the rocks, this kind of thing. Yeah, so that's often known as the day-age theory. yeah, so you can see how they're sort of seeing some conflicts and bending the Bible a bit to accommodate new geological data. Yeah, and by the 1820s, it's clear that it's not just God creating new things, but it's also taking away certain things. I guess if you're just looking in one place and you see a new species appear, you think, well, maybe it just walked in from another part of the country. But if you've started to look at fossils all over the world, then you're like, well, no, if it came from somewhere else, we would have found it somewhere else. It must be actually a new species. Um, so Buckland here, English. Most of these people, a lot of these people were sort of Christian ministers too. I think Buckland was. Anyway, fitting in with sort of similar things that I've said, we have not just a single creation in 1 week, but a progressive series of creations. And the idea with Buckland is that the Earth is changing over time in its climate. Okay, there are various ideas about that, but a lot of people thought it must have started off very hot and has been cooling down. Some people thought, I think it was originally completely covered with water, and then those waters were receding. There are various different thoughts about geology, but anyway, the climate is changing, and so the original creatures, after a while, are no longer very well adapted to what the Earth has become. So they have to be wiped out, and we have to, God, in His wisdom, is going to create some new ones. And this is not just sort of a random series, but it's kind of headed towards the point where the crowning, the pinnacle of creation will appear. That is the humans. Okay, God's image. All right. Yeah. So, So it says here that Buckland was an Anglican cleric. Okay. It's interesting. He was at a cathedral where there was apparently a Roman Catholic miracle. That is there was, I guess, a statue of a martyr up there, and the blood of the martyr was perpetually wetting the floor of the cathedral. And but Buckland wasn't necessarily convinced of this. He was a little skeptical, and he tried tasting some of this blood and pronounced it to be bat urine. One wonders, how did he know the taste of bat urine? Was he like, would he taste different animal urine to be able to identify them down the road? I don't know, but it's interesting that as an Anglican, it was probably relatively easy for him to unmask a Catholic miracle. And probably for a Catholic, it'd be easier to unmask an Anglican miracle. But anyway, Sedgwick, okay, another religious guy, as most people were back then in Europe. So he's interesting. He says, I allow, as all geologists must, a kind of progressive development. You see that this idea certainly didn't originate with Darwin, just the idea that species change over time. But it doesn't mean that it's transmutation. Okay, so he says, I say we have successive forms of animal life. Sounds a lot like Buckland again, adapted to successive conditions and not derived in natural succession in the ordinary way of generation. Okay, so if you look at one species and then its successor in the higher layers of rock, the connection between the two, he says, is not the ordinary way of generation. It's not just a chain of descent. It's not like parents having kids all the way from one to the other. So he's also rejecting the idea of transmutation here. And remember, nobody so far has a very plausible mechanism for transmutation. We're not at Darwin yet. So at this point, apart from Lamarck's sort of rather wild speculations, it just all kinds of happens. Somehow it just happens, that there's not really a theory to sort of support the idea of transmutation. Yeah. Right, and again, reference here to the changing climate over geological ages. Okay, now getting up to now very close to the time of Darwin, in fact, overlapping with Darwin, we have so-called idealists, okay, which are also the kind of creationists as well. Richard Owen is a pretty well-known biologist at the time of Darwin. I think he was the one who set up the Natural History Museum in London, which I've been to a few times. There's the big dinosaur skeletons in the entryway. It's a very impressive museum. Although I think they recently took down Richard Owen's statue and put up Darwin there because it was kind of embarrassing to have this big sort of cathedral of science with a creationist, occupying center place in the main hall. Anyway, and Agassiz was also a creationist. Yeah, so the reason why they were called idealists is that they saw the you can see similarities, even though maybe there isn't sort of very gradual changes in the fossil record. You can certainly see that certain ideas and themes are kind of maintained, so that when mammals appear, for example, they're not completely unrelated to the reptiles. In fact, all of these land-based quadrupeds or tetrapods, I think they all have like the five-fingered limb and all this kind of thing, and they'll have sort of analogous bones and whatnot in their skeleton. Yeah, so these idealists, they see these kinds of changes as kind of developing in the ideas or in the mind of the creator. Analogous, I suppose, to the way that if you look at a particular car company, Ford or GM or Mazda, you can see kind of themes, that the new model is sort of borrows from the old model, because the engineers are like lifting ideas out of that old model and then thinking how they can do it better the next time. So they keep some of the old stuff, but they also add some new things to the new model. Yeah, so something like that in biology, according to these guys. Yeah, so on this view, even though there's a kind of continuity between the old species and the new, it's not transmutation. It's not just a series. It's not like the old species actually create the new ones. It's more that the some ideas from the old species are used by the creator in the new ones. Yeah. Okay. So it's not just environmental factors. It's not what we would call evolution or transmutation. All right. Now, Charles Lyell. We're getting very close to Darwin here, because Lyell was a good friend of Darwin and also had a strong influence in the development of Darwin's own ideas. Lyell had some ideas about biology and was a creationist, but he's almost like a contradictory character, because his ideas in geology seem very kind of evolutionist, very sort of naturalist. So he seems to be a bit of have a strange mixture of ideas. So his claim to fame, now he wasn't the first uniformitarian. I think this Scottish guy Hutton, Thomas Hutton, I think he's the first uniformitarian, but Lyell was probably the best known. So this is an approach to geology that sort of rejects these kinds of fantastic stories of catastrophes and, global floods and this kind of thing. Instead sees the origin of all the, layers of rock and mountains and all this kind of thing in terms of very, very gradual creeping changes that you wouldn't really notice if you were living at that time. It's not sort of things blowing up and getting flooded and so on. And a key principle is that if you're trying to explain something in the distant past, you should only employ known naturalistic causes. Not these sort of wild, biblical ideas of catastrophe. That seems too religious, okay, which sounds funny given that I've already said he was a creationist in terms of his theory of where animals and plants came from. But anyway, that's what he said. And he also had an axe to grind here. He thought that Lamarckism was a dangerous theory. It would undermine human dignity. Okay. Yeah, and I think I've already said this, that rather than, like, if you've got this huge valley, like, or a huge canyon, like the Grand Canyon, I think if you ask a creationist, they would say that, like a young Earth kind of creationist today, they might say that that was formed in a few weeks as the receding floodwaters just sort of carved this massive channel right through all those layers of rock down like a mile deep or whatever. But not Lyell. He wouldn't go for anything like that. He would say, well, if you observe a river eroding its bank, or digging a little bit deeper into the ground, a few millimeters a year, and then multiply that by as many million years as you need, that'll account for the Grand Canyon. Okay, you need vast periods of time for that. And yet, at the same time, as I said, he thought that God was continually creating new species to fit local environments. So when Darwin is talking about the ordinary view of independent creation, he's really talking about people like Lyell who have that view. So, Lyell said that, well, he would create some species on the Galapagos and some species in Peru and so on, to fit the environment that's there. Yeah, and so a term that Lyell used would be centers of creation, or foci of creation. So they would spread out a little bit from that place where they were sort of dropped down by God. But he doesn't appeal to that sort of migration to explain all the distribution of animals across the earth, because God is sort of placing the right species in different places, just like a gardener will see a nice south-facing slope and put some plants that like the sun, and then he'll put other plants that are more shade-loving in a different spot next to the river or whatever. God is going around like that. Yeah, so Darwin and Lyell, close friends, both British, involved in British science. And yeah, Darwin, at the start of his famous Beagle expedition, he went off in this boat, around the world. I forget what his job was. Yeah, I think he was basically a companion to the captain, who otherwise would have had no one to have dinner with. I think that was the idea. Darwin, as a sort of a highly born gentleman, was of equal rank to the captain and could have dinner with him, but everyone else was a low-class scum who would have to couldn't sit at the captain's table. So I think that was the purpose. But he was involved in a lot of while he was on the journey, they kept stopping in different places, and he would collect specimens and study whatever he could find. Anyway, he was also reading the Principles of Geology, Lyell's book, and he became a convert to this uniformitarian view. And he also assumed that Lyell would be right about his creationism. And so he was looking for these sort of centers of creation for individual species and trying to make sense of that, trying to interpret the data within this Lyellian model. And as you can probably guess, in fact, you've seen some of the data with the Galapagos Islands and so on that was in the problem set 3. Data didn't always fit the model. Okay. Yeah, so before we get to Darwin's own theory of evolution, transmutation, one other theory deserves mention, and that's Robert Chambers. So this guy is not really a scientist, not a professional scientist. Chambers, you might know as a publisher. He published a dictionary, for example. And so he published this anonymously. Maybe if everyone knew who he was, they wouldn't take it seriously, because they think this guy's not even a scientist. Anyway, 1844. So we're getting kind of close to Darwin's book in 1859. Yeah, so actually it was a popular bestseller, which is interesting. There must have been quite a lot of openness among sort of literary educated people at that time in England. They weren't sort of dismissing any kind of transmutation idea as nonsense or against religion. There was some openness, but the the top scientists of that period did catch him in a lot of mistakes. So people like Sedgwick and Lyell kind of trashed the book. Nevertheless, sort of certainly in the general reading public, in a sense, prepared the ground for the origin, Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, because I mean, if James's book was a sort of commercial success and wide, favorably received, apart from a few uptight scientists, then that was a good sign that the world was ready for Darwin's book as well. Yeah, it's also interesting that Chambers, like everyone else, had to trash Lamarck here. Yeah, he says, obviously evolution couldn't happen the way Lamarck said. Completely inadequate, so inadequate, we can only place it with pity among the follies of the wise. So, we know that wise people, or that is educated people, say the stupidest things, like, philosophers, for example, say all kinds of inconceivable nonsense. And, poor Lamarck suffers from that particular problem as well. Okay, well, now we've set the stage for Darwin to enter the picture, and I'll save that for part 2.